Hello, Kristen.
Hi, Bill. How are you?
I'm good. So our regular DMZ partner, Matt Lewis, is celebrating the birth of his second child, Beckett Wilberforce Lewis.
Greatest name ever.
So we're giving him a break, it's always good to have Kristen Soltis back on the show, especially today of all days, because as she is a pollster extraordinaire, she has been scouring the exit poll data ever since Election Day. I know she's been on some panels since, but this is a real treat for all the DMZ fans out there to get, real under-the-surface analysis about what really happened, stuff I don't think you're getting in a lot of the superficial coverage in the traditional media. So thanks so much for taking the time to do this.
Of course.
Now, what we're hearing a lot about the demographic shifts in the electorate boosting Obama. We're hearing talk from the right that there was a depressed base on the right. We're hearing Paul Ryan characterize it as a surprising urban vote that carried the day for Obama. Do you have a bottom line analysis that is different from all that, or are you in line with what the general conventional wisdom is?
So my bottom line is that Republicans are about the same size as a group as they were 4 years ago. But that is not the case for the Democratic Party. And as a result, Republicans, I think, the assumption, and this is why you had so many Republican pollsters, this whole unskewed polls thing going on, was because they said, well, look, John McCain there was no enthusiasm on the right for John McCain, that he wasn't getting huge turnouts at rallies. He really, he had to pick Sarah Palin to get anyone excited about his candidacy, and then that turned into what it turned into. So the assumption was, well, Mitt Romney's got 30,000 people that have turned out for him at a rally in the cold in Pennsylvania. This must mean something. We must have some kind of magic fairy dust that's out there and that has just riled up everyone, and this is going to be a change election and we're going to win. And the polls are wrong. And that's what happens when you trust anecdotes over data. You get really surprised. So, I think that there were, as far as Republicans talking about how, our base didn't turn out, Republicans were still the same proportion of the electorate that they were 4 years ago. Still 32% of the vote. Conservatives there still remain a lot more conservatives than liberals. Self-identified in the exit polls. So, in my opinion, this wasn't so much the base wasn't excited about Mitt Romney and didn't turn out. I don't have any data to confirm or reject the idea that there was, an evangelical issue. Some people had thought maybe because Romney was Mormon, would that mean evangelicals wouldn't turn out for him? I've seen no evidence to back that up. I think people were just surprised because the party ID in 2004 was even. And the party ID in 2008 was Democrats had 7% more than Republicans did. Republicans were 32, Democrats were 39. And a lot of folks were saying, well, there's no way this is going to be like 2008 again. Barack Obama is not this choose-your-own-adventure candidate. He's got a record to run on. The economy's not great. The fundamentals would suggest this would be an election much more favorable to Republicans. So a lot of folks dismissed the polls that were showing Barack Obama doing pretty well because they said, well, this is not going to be an election like 2008. It's going to be closer to 2004. And that was simply wrong. I don't think that it was a matter of the base sitting home. I think it's a matter of the base just not being big enough. So, and that's the tough reality for people.
I want to get to your prescriptions for how to deal with this from a Republican perspective. But before we do that, I just want to drill down a little bit about some of the specific data. So we've been hearing from Rush Limbaugh, from Newt Gingrich, that there were 2 million votes less for Romney than McCain, and they were stunned by that. How could Romney have even less base enthusiasm than McCain did? But the most updated numbers, and I'm looking at David Wasserman, who works at the Cook Political Report. He tweets at Redistrict. He has a Google spreadsheet that's public, so he has the latest and greatest raw vote totals. McCain ended up at 59.9 million, and right now Romney is at 59.6 million, and votes are still trickling in. So it looks like he's going to be about the same, maybe even a little bit more than McCain. So is the conservative argument just off target, saying, obviously we have to be more conservative because the problem was that the conservatives didn't show up?
So, two parts to that. The reason why I think they're still stuck on this argument is because it was an argument that was hatched, right after Election Day, when those were accurate numbers, and people have not adapted to the updated data. So, I think it's less a case of people being maliciously, intentionally wrong than they got a piece of data that was good on Thursday of last week and is no longer good today. So shame on them for not updating their knowledge of the election. But I don't think that I think it's more accidental ignorance than anything. In terms of the whole, this means we need to be more conservative. So this is a debate that you knew was coming, right? That you were going to have the moderates who are saying, there are none of us left. You have kicked us all out of the party. And there aren't enough of you anymore, so you need to do things to bring us from the middle back into the party. And on the other hand, you now have the conservatives who are saying, yeah, there's not enough of us, because you've got all of these conservatives who think that the Republican Party doesn't stand for them anymore because it's too moderate and too wishy-washy and blah, 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 and so you need to get more conservative. And so there's this idea that, the Republican Party needs to pick up the stakes of its tent and move it a few feet to the right or a few feet to the left. And the problem is neither of those actions actually makes the tent bigger. And I thought, Matt Lewis actually had a really great post up last week where he said the problem isn't that you need to move right or left, it's that you need to modernize. It's not, or rather he said it's not about moderating, it's modernizing. And I thought that was a wise take. For me, my frustration is, what was Mitt Romney saying to anyone besides someone who was wealthy and going to get hit with a tax hike if Barack Obama was elected president? Why was Mitt Romney's presidency make you better off? I mean, concretely. So conservatives have this problem where we look at things like low taxes, low spending, reduced regulation, and we view them as goods in and of themselves with inherent value, that they are the ends, rather than the means to an end of prosperity or, social mobility. We love talking about the tax cuts themselves or the spending cuts themselves, rather than explaining, here's why we think that's actually good for you. And because of that, you wind up with a very small group of people, the Republican Party, who votes for Mitt Romney because they sort of intuitively get, okay, I think I can see how a 20% tax cut across the board might be good for people. And then you have a lot of folks that are like, but don't we have a really big deficit? And so somebody explain to me what you're going to do for me. And I don't think that it's this whole Mitt Romney gifts thing, I think is pretty terrible. Because it's not, I do think to an extent it's much easier to say you're going to give people things, but also I think the Democratic Party was really good this year about saying, here's how our policies are going to directly benefit you. We're going to make sure that you have access to free contraception. We're going to make sure that, Pell Grants aren't cut and are expanded. These are concrete things, and I don't think of them as like gifts to try to get favor with these groups so much as this is Democratic policies applied, and it means giving people things that they might not have had otherwise.
But didn't Mitt Romney say, like I think Republicans generally do, that if you broadly keep tax rates low and if you broadly keep regulations to a minimum, that's going to give the job creators more freedom and more capital to invest in the country, and create jobs and expand growth. I mean, they make the argument,
but
but people don't seem to accept the argument in large part because we did try under Bush and it wasn't seen as working. And this strikes me as the biggest challenge here. How do Republicans and conservatives say, okay, we get that this basic concept did not work under Bush, and we know that, we take responsibility for it, and we've made adjustments to our philosophy because of it.
See, but I don't necessarily think it's about an adjustment to philosophy. So the example that I've been using of this is the biggest problem is that Obama could do this and we couldn't. Is Obama gave an interview on MTV about 2 weeks before the election. And the big thing that I had been pushing sort of internally to my fellow Republican comrades was, if you want to win the youth vote, you need to talk about how you're going to make it easier for them to start their own business. Because surveys show, significant numbers of young people, their goal is to start their own business, including majorities of young Latino and young African American folks. So we need to be talking about what's our party doing that's helping them start their own business. And I guarantee you, had Mitt Romney been asked that question, his answer would have been, I want to reduce regulation and I want to keep your taxes low so that you can keep more of what you earn and that you can have the freedom and flexibility to start your own business. That's like Republican boilerplate talking point stuff. Mitt Romney or Barack Obama was asked this question in the MTV interview. What are you doing as president to help make sure that, help young people start their own business? And I was like, all right, let's see what he says. And his response was genius, because it should have been a Republican answer. I mean, I was dumbfounded. He said, one of the things that we've done is we noticed that there was some financial regulation in place that was prohibiting small investors from being able to make investments online. And we saw those as unhelpful regulations. And so we peeled those back so that individuals could make investments in things they thought were good ideas to help spark innovation, make sure that small business people had the capital they needed and could reach out to others who thought they had a good idea. So, now crowdfunding is more of a thing, and we adapted and repealed regulation in order to make that possible. And I was like, he just talked about removing financial regulation to make Kickstarter possible. Can you imagine, and that in so many ways could have been, you could have had a conservative. There's nothing about that idea that I oppose. I think that's great. And I'm like, oh, no.
Well, why is it then? This strikes me as sort of the heart of the matter. Obama is not just a caricature of a left-wing stereotype. He has said, he also talked about the value of regulation a lot in the campaign, the value of government investment a lot. I don't think he was running a more Clinton-style era of big government is over campaign, but it certainly was balanced with examples where let's have smarter, more effective regulation, and why Republicans couldn't look at things like Dodd-Frank or things like Obamacare and acknowledge that there are Republican ideas intermixed in these bills and take some credit for that instead of trying to just create their own fictional narrative about how socialist all this was. If they took a more nuanced approach to these things, might they have gained more credibility with the middle of the country?
I think so, possibly. You're already seeing it start to happen on immigration. It's not even 2 weeks later, and already Republicans are saying, okay, maybe there's some pieces to the Obama approach to immigration that we can get behind. And you're already starting to see, Bill Kristol saying, are we really going to throw ourselves on the sword for, keeping taxes low on millionaires? So you're already beginning to see some folks that are saying, I don't know that the way we talk about our ideas is sustainable, that we ought to not just reject everything because the other guy is doing it. I think that you are right in that, and you actually, what's interesting is there were moments in the primary campaign. I remember Mitt Romney sort of getting poked fun at because he had said nice things about Secretary of Education Arne Duncan, and it was like there was this real sense that if you'd ever said anything positive about anything that had come from the other side, that it was a problem. Which is why I think it was really refreshing, at least for me, when Mitt Romney in that first debate started talking about bipartisanship and talking about working across the aisle and stuff. And I was like, oh, that's nice. I mean, it is September. So
it was very late in the game when he started doing things like that. And those are arguably his best weeks in the campaign when he did.
Right. Exactly. And there was, and it was also at that time where he got as close as I think he came to trying to explain this 5-point plan for America. And the thing that I wrote a piece at U.S. News yesterday where I said that I think the problem Republicans have most is that we have become so afraid of this concept of if you're explaining, you're losing. And then simultaneously, we go and fall in love with people like Paul Ryan because we're like, well, but he explains things so well. And I think we've got to figure out that there is a happy medium between, Paul Ryan and 15 PowerPoint slides and really just sort of saying this, having every answer that comes out of your candidate's mouth be incredibly predictable. That's why I think people love Bill Clinton, right? I mean, weren't people saying after his convention speech, he needs to be nominated to be Secretary of Explaining Stuff? Well, that wasn't the exact language used.
Well, I think that was actually.
I heard a different word than stuff.
Oh, okay. I think Barack Obama actually used that exact phrasing on the stuff.
So, and we don't really have a Secretary of Explaining Stuff.
But obviously, Ryan was sold that way.
And then, where did you hear from him? Where did he go?
Well, I mean, he had a moment. He had a few weeks, but those were weeks where they're getting beat upside the head about his actual budget. I always thought it was strange. I mean, this sort of speaks to something that I've talked about a lot, the closed loop that the Republican Party and the conservative movement has been in. There was this notion that Ryan had this extraordinary talent to communicate conservative ideas to folks outside of the party, and that tended to be hung on the fact that he wins his union-heavy district in Wisconsin, and he has he had this nominal agreement with Senator Wyden about Medicare, which Wyden didn't really fully embrace. Therefore, he's uniquely bipartisan and uniquely articulate. But that premise had never really actually been tested on a national scale before, and the evidence proved that when you take his basic idea to partially privatize Medicare, he did not have any sort of unique, super special talking points that dazzled the public. It was the same stuff we always.
They tried not to talk about it at all. At the House level, they tried to go on offense. I was constantly getting emails from the NRCC saying, "We're going on offense on Medicare." And I think in the end, the exit polls showed it wound up basically being a draw. I don't think that it wound up. People thought it was going to be. At first, they thought it would be a net negative, and then they tried to make the argument maybe it'll be a net positive, and it wound up kind of being a wash. I'm trying to find the exact number now so that I'm not just making this up. But I remember there was a
question in the exit poll: who would better handle Medicare? And Obama was at 52 and Romney was at 44, which I imagine is somewhat similar to past, because Democrats generally do poll better on Medicare.
Right.
But maybe it wasn't a cratering for Romney that you might expect, considering the position they were taking.
Right. And so, the concern was that it was going to be this huge issue that was going to drag down the ticket. And ultimately, in the end, you didn't hear about it at all. The big thing was 47%.
Right.
So it wound up being much more about issues of sort of social mobility and economic equality, and it wound up being much less about entitlement programs, I think.
Now, the other aspect of the closed loop that's getting more talk about, you know more about this because it involves the pollster community, how not just at the blog level with unskewedpolls.com was there a notion that the polls were wildly biased towards Obama, but it seemed to actually be embraced at the upper echelons of the Republican Party, inside the Romney inner sanctum, inside the Republican pollster community. They were doing their own weighing of the poll data. The whole argument was that the traditional media polls were assuming too many Democrats were going to show up, and that was making the polls be a dead heat. And if you had more parity with Democrats and Republicans in the electorate, then Romney would definitely win. And therefore, the Romney internal polling models would have to be correct. And just one example is you already mentioned that the actual party turnout, the Democrats were up by 6 points over Republicans, which was almost the same as 2008. I know that the Romney team was very focused on the fact they were winning with independents in all their polling. And in fact, in the final exit poll, they did win with independents. Mm-hmm. Romney had 50% and Obama had 45. But there's a one exit poll question that is, are you a Democrat, Republican, or independent? There's a separate one that is, are you a liberal, moderate, or conservative? And Obama won with moderates very handily, 56% to 41%, and moderates were the plurality of the electorate. They were 41% versus conservatives 35 and liberals 25. Mm-hmm. That's a pretty high number for liberals, I think, relatively speaking.
Liberals did go up. So it seems as though, liberal oasis, you guys are at the forefront. I think the word liberal is, because I think a lot of people would call themselves moderate, but who were really sort of, that center-left leaning.
Well, that's sort of my point. That the people who call themselves independent are not identical to the people who call themselves moderates. Right. And there are some posters out there saying, look, we are picking up that the independent community is right-leaning. And the Romney team didn't seem to believe that or hear it or what. It just strikes me as odd. It does not strike me as odd that a blogger or a talk show host would embrace sort of the easiest explanation for things. It strikes me as very strange that a political professional who should be above the emotional arguments and be just looking at data would be so blind to that possibility and base so much strategy on something that was just flat out wrong.
Well, it's because independents have typically been, independents almost always go with the winner. An exception being 2004, where George W. Bush was able to eke out a very slim lead despite losing independents by a very slim margin. But generally, it's because if you look at 2010, independents swung heavily back to the right. And in 2008, Barack Obama won independents by 8. 2006, Democratic House candidates won independents by double digits. So independents they've sort of bounced back and forth with the winner. And so the thought was, well, if people who call themselves independents are bouncing back to the right, that's a good sign for us. There was some chatter that, well, the reason why independents are voting for Romney this time, even though they broke for Barack Obama 4 years ago, is that a bunch of people have left the party in the last 4 years. And my pushback to that was always, the brand of the GOP was really horrible 4 years ago. And the polls actually show it's about where it was. So it's still really bad. But it has not gotten worse. And actually, since there was that 2010 election, there was a thought, well, maybe some more people have come home to the GOP. So I did, and I still do, reject this idea that lots of people left the party over the last 4 years and made independents structurally a different looking group. I do think that Mitt Romney had a greater appeal to more swingy voters than John McCain did, in part, I think, because he didn't have Sarah Palin on his ticket. However, it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough. You needed to win independents by a lot more than 5 points if you're talking about an election with the makeup of 2008. And the thing that I think Republican pollsters got wrong, and I hate to trash my colleagues, and I don't want that to be what this comes across as, but as someone who is younger in the field, I have always had severe concerns that my colleagues were missing out on young voters and Latino voters and African American voters because we assume that they are just not going to turn out in as big of numbers. And as a result, methodologically, they don't use enough cell phones in their samples. I don't know if the Romney campaign was doing Spanish language interviewing or not, in statewide polls in places like Florida or Nevada. They may have only been interviewing English. That's going to leave some people left out of your poll. So there are some methodological things that you do differently.
Can't you wait for that? Can't you at least, if you're not actually calling the cell phones or calling the Spanish speakers, can't you still weigh? Can you still jack up your young person numbers and jack up your Hispanic numbers?
So differently. So think about it this way. If I do a survey of 1,000 registered voters, and I'm only doing landlines, and I'm capturing a small amount of 18 to 29-year-olds, and I say, well, they only make up 10% of my sample. I need it to be closer to 19 because that's what it's going to be in the election. So I'll just double the value of each of those interviews in my sample. The problem is all those 18 to 29-year-olds that I'm talking to are either living in college dorms, they're living at their parents' house, or they're married and have a home of their own. They're probably not young, living in a city. You know, Pew has shown there are significantly different characteristics between cell phone only young people and young people who have access to a landline. So there are things you can't just wait away. You have to, I mean, people with landlines are different in many ways, much more likely to be homeowners, much more likely to be married, much more likely to have children than people who don't have landlines. And these are not just things you can wait out of the way.
So why is it that professional, very well paid Republican pollsters, didn't go the extra mile to do stuff like that for the sake of their own clients? Is it just, look, these are good people, and they just were a little bit behind the curve this one because they're older and they have to get with the times, or is there something deeper that the Republican Party as a whole is just too cut off from the rest of the national discussion, and aren't thinking about stuff like that because they're relying so much on Fox News and Rush Limbaugh? And I feel like there are sort of non-pollster things, for example, when the 47% comment from Romney, when Romney didn't know that Obama had called the Benghazi attack an act of terror a day afterwards, just simply didn't seem to know it in that second debate. Stuff like that just makes me feel like there's some real deep-seated problem where they're hermetically sealed from the rest of society. But you're closer to the pollster community than I am. I mean, do you have a sense that these folks are just disconnected, or just good guys that just were a little slow?
I think they were good guys who got it a little slow, and then the people who there's a lot of deference that gets given to pollsters, I think, where if a pollster says, "Trust me, I've been doing races for 2 decades. I've run, I've done the numbers for campaigns going back, into the 80s. Trust me, I know what I'm doing." I mean, there's a lot of deference that is given to that. And I would often find myself as someone who's sort of an advocate for telling people about the importance of young voters. I would always hear, well, young voters are always just more democratic and young voters never turn out. And I, would present all this data to show, no, neither of those two things are true. And people,
it used to be true, right?
What do you mean it used to be true?
I mean, it used to be that young voters do not turn out. Isn't that the case?
Young voters have never been less than 17% of the electorate since 1972, when the voting age was changed to 18. So, I mean, that was actually one of the big things that came out of the election last time, where people thought all of this huge surge in young voters had happened. And actually, it was only as a piece of the pie. It had only grown from 17 to 18%. And as a piece of the pie this time, it went from 18 to 19%, despite polls consistently showing that young people would be less enthusiastic and less excited about this election. So, I had to push back against folks who thought, that the quantity of young voters in a presidential year swings wildly, and it doesn't. I mean, there is a huge drop-off between a presidential year and a midterm, but presidential year to presidential year, they were 17% of the electorate in 2004. They were 17% of the electorate in 2000. They were 17% of the electorate in 1996. And
now they're 19.
And now they're 19.
And this is folks 18 to 29 years old.
That's right.
So you're saying the difference is not, there's a tiny tick upwards in their proportion of the electorate, but the share that Democrats are getting from that, I take it, is much larger than in past years.
Yes. So, and that was the jarring thing about 2008, was that George W. Bush lost young voters by 9. George W. Bush lost young voters in 2004 by 9 points. He actually won young voters in Ohio and Virginia in his first run in 2000. He beat Al Gore among young voters in these two kind of swing states. So these are things that just people don't know, because it's so much easier to operate under the assumption that all those young people, they're just dumb, they don't care, they're watching The Daily Show, they're not going to vote for me anyways, let's just move on. And I do think that the assumption that these other groups are lost causes was really detrimental to Republicans, because they thought they could win just by winning huge numbers of older voters, of whiter voters, of wealthier voters, and that math doesn't work anymore.
Now, I do think it's unusual, and maybe my institutional memory is wrong. I'm not aware of a past presidential campaign pre-Obama that was so premised on rallies at college campuses. I don't even recall when I was in college that candidates regularly went to college campuses for their rallies. And Obama seemed to put extra emphasis on that. And always had a big chunk of the stump about student loans and student loan debt and how he took out the middleman of the banks and how he fought to keep interest rates low. I don't recall those being staples of presidential campaign rhetoric, pre-Obama. And it seems like the Romney campaign didn't really have that as part of their strategy to have any kind of policy appeal to young voters. They thought they could stoke anger at the state of the economy with young voters, but didn't have a policy prescription to do about it beyond what we talk about the more generic Republican boilerplate. I mean, does that strike you as accurate that one party is trying with young voters and the other party isn't?
I think that's relative. That's somewhat correct. So there were moments when you could tell that Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan wanted to make overtures, and those overtures would always wind up being sort of a restatement of the economic hardship that young voters were facing. So I did the polling for a super PAC, Crossroads Generation, sort of loosely affiliated with American Crossroads. They were one of the initial funding partners. We wound up spending, I think, about $1 million, which sounds like a lot of money, but then compared to how much was spent overall, I mean, it's tough to move the needle these days with $1 million nationwide.
We're talking about a $2 billion campaign.
Yeah, so we were a teeny little non-blip on the radar. But we did some research in August to try to figure out, so what should we be doing with our resources? How should we be trying to make the case to young people? And up until that point, we've been very focused on saying, like, hey, unemployment is really bad for young people. Despite all the promises, college tuition continues to go up and there's no end in sight. Things are really bad for you. And we did all of this research and found, young people get it. They're living it every day. We don't need to tell young people who are living in their parents' basement, isn't it so terrible to live in your parents' basement? And that was sort of what our messaging was this like, sucks to be you, doesn't it? Isn't that really terrible? Isn't it so horrible that things are so horrible for you? And there was never, and so what we also did was we asked this question, do you think that Barack Obama supports policies that would make it easier for you and your friends to get jobs? And Barack Obama actually didn't do very well on that question. He got a very poor response, but Mitt Romney got a worse response. So there was opportunity there. Young people were not overwhelmingly convinced, at least in August, that Barack Obama had the answers that were going to help them get jobs. They were open to hearing, so what would Republicans do? And we tested out some of the elements. I mean, again, this is sort of boilerplate, I mean, very broad level, keeping regulation low on small businesses, stuff like that. But we tested that without saying it was a Republican policy, without saying it was part of Mitt Romney's plan. And it actually did really well, including things that I was surprised and I thought wouldn't do very well, which were, expanding drilling for more domestic sources of energy. I mean, things that I thought, well, but young people are a little more environmental, maybe they won't be crazy about that. There were elements of Romney's policies that they really liked. The problem was, if you associated them back with Republicans and Mitt Romney, it was a non-starter. The party brand is just so horribly damaged among young people that they were kind of willing to hear from us and to hear us make an argument about why we should earn their vote, but never really did. And so in the end, that overwhelmingly negative brand just killed our chances.
So how do you square that data to come up with a prescription for Republican change? Is it that the low tax, low regulation message, is perfectly fine, and you just need better messengers to deliver it, or is it that maybe that poll's fine in a vacuum, but once you actually have once you duke it out with other facts and figures about what's happened in America over the past 10 years, whatever initial appeal it has falls apart, and the Republican brand goes down with it because that's the party that tried to implement it in the Bush years and it failed miserably.
Well, okay, now hold on. Now I have got to push back a little bit against this idea. Like, I let you get away with it the first time, but I'm not going to let you get away with it the second time. The idea that the Bush tax cuts caused the recession. I'm totally tired of hearing the idea, I mean, you cannot just take everything that you disliked about Bush's presidency and say that caused the recession, and so obviously we should never do it again.
I wouldn't say point A to point B.
But you did just say point A to point B, though.
I'm saying the combination of, I think it's a fact that having low tax cuts for the rich under the Bush years did not magically create oodles of jobs. And having lax regulation enforcement policies did not certainly stem having a giant global financial crisis. I mean, that's what
I'm always curious about is people saying, all of this deregulation that allowed this to happen. And the biggest example I always hear is Glass-Steagall, which was repealed under Clinton. So I'm always interested,
Clinton gets blamed.
What regulations you want back in place that Bush undid?
Clinton gets some blame for financial deregulation. I don't discount that at all, although I do accept the argument that you can't draw point A to point B to Glass-Steagall repeal and the crisis.
Correct.
But I take there's the credit swap deregulation that probably has more direct of a connection. But I think the bigger issue is that the financial deregulation started under Clinton and was adhered to. It started with Clinton with the Republican Congress, I should say, but certainly Clinton was a happy part of that. You deregulated the system very broadly. Any thought to what you were, and maybe there's an argument that things had to be modernized, that you had regulation was 70 years old and the structure of banks was different today. Fine, but if you're going to take that away, at the barest minimum, you should be tracking developments very closely to see if you should replace them with something else, based on how the markets react to that deregulation. And certainly the Bush administration had no interest in doing that.
What I fail to understand, though, is why that therefore means that Republicans shouldn't talk about, here's why we think that keeping taxes low on your business helps you keep more money in your business and helps your business grow. Why that therefore makes the argument invalid that there are some regulations, for instance, the ones that Barack Obama repealed to make Kickstarter possible, that there are some regulations that are bad. This is why I think the explaining side needs to happen more, because we like to talk about regulation like it's all a bad thing and taxes like it's all a bad thing. And I think we need to be, when people criticize us for saying, tell us what you're going to cut, tell us what taxes you think are bad, tell us what regulations you want to get rid of, I do agree that that's a legitimate criticism, because I don't think we can any longer just say, let's just get rid of regulation, because there are such good examples of where removal of regulation has led to problems. So I will concede to you that we have a more difficult challenge, but I don't think that undermines the entire I don't think that the financial crisis of 2008 undermines the entire conservative philosophy and means we have to go find a bunch of new principles to stand for.
I mean, and Romney had some, some rhetoric towards that end. He would try to say, particularly in the home stretch of the campaign, that not all regulation was bad, and he would replace Dodd-Frank with smarter regulation. He would make those concessions at the top, but he never then followed up by saying, and here are the kinds of regulations that I would do that I think are smarter, more effective. And is your final policy prescription here? Then maybe this is not demographic specific, just that Republicans have to articulate a recalibrated conservative ideology that acknowledges room for some levels of government and some amount of regulation and specifies what that is.
I think that makes sense. I think that, so let's take Dodd-Frank as an example. I imagine if you did a survey and asked, like, what's the name ID and the fave-unfave of Dodd-Frank, it would be relatively low. And yet throughout the Republican primaries, you had Newt Gingrich, for one, always talking about how bad Dodd-Frank was. And it was like, voters aren't dumb, they're just busy. And I don't know, Dodd-Frank itself is sort of this ever-growing octopus of regulation. Like, nobody really knows what all of it is. So why aren't conservatives then saying, here are specifically the things about Dodd-Frank we don't like? We think that Dodd-Frank gives competitive advantage to big businesses that have the resources to comply with all of these regulations, while local community banks are going to have much more problems hiring the army of lawyers necessary to implement it. And therefore, we are privileged. This policy actually privileges big banks over the little banks that might be the ones you want to go to get your small business loan. And so that's why we're helping you as a potential entrepreneur by opposing pieces of this law. I mean, did you ever hear that? Did you ever hear that argument? I mean, it's one that I'll hear smart conservative policy analysts talk about. But that was never an argument that was getting made on the stump about here's a problem that we think exists with Dodd-Frank, and here's how we would change it. And so, yes, in my opinion, I think it is important for us, rather than just having these blanket, less government, less regulation, less taxes, to get a little more specific about what we think is bad, why we think it's bad, and how we would make it good. And until we get there, I think you've got a lot of young people, you've got a lot of non-white Americans, you've got a lot of particularly young women who are saying, what's so great about the conservative philosophy that's going to make my life any better?
Now, it seems that Republicans and conservatives seem allergic to this kind of advice because they fear that if they make some concession on regulation, some concession on the role of government, then that sort of, that's a crack in the firewall. Everything falls apart. It's a slippery slope, and all of a sudden you're Democrat light. And I wrote a piece for Matt Lewis's publication, The Daily Caller, titled "Advice from a Liberal," because I try to be generous with my thoughts. You. No problem. And I point out that, look, Democrats were in this place after the Dukakis beating. We'd lost 3 presidential elections in a row. Dukakis was totally thrashed about his liberalism and his social values, and Democrats got kind of scared straight. And so Clinton rose, and he made some very notable concessions where he heartily embraced the death penalty, and he heartily embraced ending welfare as we know it, and specifically ending a time limit, inserting time limits on how much welfare benefits the poor are allowed to have access to. And these are things that liberals to this day still, are bruised over. And on top of it, Clinton didn't do this, but after Clinton, there's additional concession on guns. We don't really see Democrats push serious gun control anymore. And look, and I didn't vote for Clinton in 1992 in part for some of this stuff. I was very angry about the abandoning of the death penalty, and I thought he was a big sellout. But in retrospect, you can see that the Democratic brand was really battered at that point. There was a sense that Democrats just were not in sync with mainstream America, and a couple of dramatic things had to be done to communicate to the public, this is a different Democratic Party, and he was able to do that in a way that, at least over time, it did not abandon the entire liberal project, because now you are in a situation where Democrats still don't embrace the death penalty, and they still aren't saying let's scrap welfare reform, and they still aren't saying let's expand gun control, and yet you have the most liberal president, since at least Lyndon Johnson. So it shows that not all slopes are slippery. You can make some strategic concessions, as unpleasant as they may be very bitter pills, and you can make very indignant, self-righteous moral arguments why those things remain to be horrible. But a lot of good things have happened from a liberal perspective in the past 4 years because those pills were swallowed. So, and I said in the piece, look, you can, in theory, accept contraception coverage. You can accept climate science. You can accept that taxes go up in certain circumstances sometimes. You can accept some degree of regulation. You can accept the existence of FEMA and still believe and still communicate a belief in low taxes generally and minimal regulation generally and limited government generally. But you have to have some flexibility in how you implement that if you're going to be a competitive party nationally. I think you and I are on the same page on this, at least in the big sense.
And I think the other thing that is an important takeaway there is the way Clinton was able to rehabilitate the Democratic brand was in large part based on sort of those policy positions. I mean, there was also a great deal, I think, there's the policy and there's the message, and I think he was very good on both. What worries me, this is my big fear going into the next 2 to 4 years, is that Republicans will think that the way to the hearts of the Latino community is let's reform immigration and let's put Marco Rubio on TV a lot, or that the way to reach young people will be to try to just talk about college tuition and to try to send their candidates to do more interviews on MTV. And I think that those are all good things, but those are not the silver bullet. And in a way there's a risk of them being condescending. So I am concerned a little bit that the
So what do you
reaction
do
to this
what do you do
election
instead?
on the side of the Republicans will not be, hey, let's talk about how our policies make people the 100% better off, and instead will become about more of the cosmetics. And I do think there is a cosmetic problem, but I don't think it is just a cosmetic problem.
So just think about Latinos specifically. If just putting Rubio on TV and Governor Susan Martinez on TV more, and brokering a deal on immigration reform, if that's not sufficient, maybe it's necessary, but if it's not sufficient, what else do you do to appeal to you have a particular large block of voters that you're just getting, your clock cleaned on. Mm-hmm. What do you do?
I think the issue of education offers great opportunities there. You've got a lot of people who, their kids are in schools that they're failing their kids, and there are some status quo forces that are sometimes make it more challenging to put in place reforms that would put the best teachers in the schools with the most struggling students, et cetera, et cetera. So, Republicans, but the problem is right now we're so focused on get the federal government entirely out of education that it's tough for us to have a conversation about, okay, well, how can federal government be a force for good to put pressure and accountability on these failing schools and to pull some policy levers to make sure these kids aren't being, I don't want to say left behind, but left behind. There are, on the issue of how are we going to help people start their own small businesses? How are we going to help people pursue economic opportunity? These aren't just things that would appeal to the Latino community, but I sure think they're a great place to start. I don't think it's all about immigration, and I think there has to be a real sense of how are our policies enabling people to have strong families that can enter the middle class if they're not there already, and can make sure that their kids are having a brighter future than they had. And I think there is a way to do it, and it is not the easy path. The easy path is putting Marco Rubio on TV more, and I hope we will not settle for the easy path.
Well, I hope for the sake of sound policy debate and reality-based politics, I hope that your party listens to you.
We'll see. They didn't 4 years ago, but who knows? Maybe.
I do think that it might take three. It might take three losses before you really hit rock bottom.
So I'll leave you with this one piece of data that, at least in terms of my now 4-year-long crusade on young voters, this is the number that I think really shakes people up. Okay. Mitt Romney won the popular vote nationally by about 2 million votes if you take all of the voters under the age of 30 out of the equation. Barack Obama wins voters under the age of 30 by about 5 million votes, and that puts him over the top. So, and in swing states like Ohio, Virginia, and Florida, Mitt Romney wins the popular vote there among voters aged 30 and older. But he loses 18 to 29-year-olds by such a wide margin that it doesn't matter. So
does that lead to a brand loyalty problem too? If they become Democrats at that age, that carry over the rest of their lives.
This is why I began the crusade 4 years ago, is because I said if we don't fix this, once young people have 8 years of a Democratic president that they like a lot, 2 presidential elections where they vote back to back for Democrats, that's going to create brand loyalty. And the way you you see it in the exit polls when you look at how Obama did among each age group relative to how he did 4 years ago. Obama does worse among every age group, including the youngest voters. He fell off 11 points among 18 to 29-year-olds, except one group, 30-somethings. He actually did 3 points better in terms of his margin over the Republican this time around than 4 years ago. And it's because those millennials that stuck with the president 4 years ago, or that voted for him 4 years ago, have stuck with him. They've gotten older. They've entered their 30s. And this conservative fantasy that these people are going to get older and suddenly wake up and love the Republican Party and be conservative is just wrong. And that's the data point that I point to. Look, they got older. They became 30-somethings, and they stuck with the president. And I'm hoping that will wake people up, that we cannot sustain another election at the presidential level where the millennial generation breaks so heavily away from Republicans, or else it is going to be a huge mathematical problem for the party for decades to come.
Very interesting, very sobering, I think, for the Republican side of the aisle. But I would say, from a Democratic perspective, I would think these are fixable things. So
they are very fixable. But
right. So Democrats should assume that's a glide path. There's still going to be arguments and competition, presuming that eventually Republicans see the light one of these days. So we'll see how fast they get to it. Thanks so much. Any other final thoughts before we take off?
Nope, that's it.
Where can we find some of your other thoughts on the subject?
So I have a bunch of charts up about young voters, if charts are your thing, KristenSoltis.com. And I sort of tweeted feverishly about this in the immediate aftermath of the election. So I'm on Twitter at @KLSoltis if you are interested in hunting there.
Excellent. Thanks so much. I got to work out with Matt if we're going to be back for Thanksgiving week or wait another week. But we'll have Matt back very soon. Congrats again on his second child, and we'll see you soon here on the DMZ.